Winter had gripped the Ardennes with a ferocity that matched the violence unfolding across its snow-covered forests. The year was 1944, and the Allies were unprepared for the storm that would soon batter their lines. German forces, under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, launched a surprise offensive on December 16th, an attack that came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Amidst the bitter cold, the sounds of artillery shells and machine gun fire became a grim symphony, echoing across the frozen countryside. In the heart of the chaos, the Allied front lines began to crumble, but even as the German forces pushed relentlessly forward, there remained a pocket of resistance, an outpost where one American general would prove unyielding. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, found his forces surrounded on all sides by the encroaching Wehrmacht. Supplies were dwindling, morale was sinking, and retreat seemed inevitable. The German forces believed the town and its defending troops would fall within days. Yet McAuliffe, undeterred by the odds or the frigid cold, stood resolute at his post. To the enemy, his surrender was merely a formality, a question of when, not if. As the German commanders closed in, they sent a message to McAuliffe demanding that he surrender. The letter, delivered under a white flag, carried with it an offer to spare his troops if they laid down their arms, but McAuliffe had no intention of surrendering. In his command center, surrounded by maps and the unrelenting sounds of battle, he read the German demand. Without hesitation, he delivered his response. The word he spoke would become legend, a rallying cry for the embattled Allies and a symbol of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. "Nuts," he said, his voice steady and resolute. It was a simple word, a rejection of the German offer that carried the weight of an unspoken promise to stand firm no matter the cost. The audacity of his response stunned the German forces, who could scarcely believe the gall of an American general, surrounded and outnumbered, refusing to yield. But McAuliffe's defiance would not be in vain. His refusal galvanized his troops, gave them strength in the face of certain defeat. It was not just a battle of weapons, but a battle of will. The German commanders, taken aback by the brevity and certainty of the reply, would soon realize that this moment was more than just an act of resistance. It was the spark of a legend. The word "nuts" would echo through history, a symbol of defiance that would inspire the Allies to push back, to find victory even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And in the days that followed, McAuliffe's resolve would prove contagious, rallying not just his men, but the entire Allied war effort. In the bitter cold of Bastogne, a moment of defiance would become a rallying cry. But little did McAuliffe know, the consequences of his decision would ripple far beyond the Ardennes, altering the course of the battle and of history itself. December 1944. In the cold, biting winter air of the Ardennes, Adolf Hitler's desperation manifested in a final, furious gamble. The war was slipping from Germany's grasp, and he was willing to risk everything in one last push. Operation Watch on the Rhine was his attempt to split the Allied lines, severing their connection and forcing them to fight a war on two fronts. It was an audacious strategy, one that sought to catch the Allies off guard, precisely the advantage that Germany needed. The plan was as bold as it was brutal, a surge of German forces through the dense forests of the Ardennes. The terrain was unforgiving, the weather inhospitable, and yet Hitler believed that with this attack, the Allies could be broken. The offensive began on December 16th, and the Allied forces were unprepared for the ferocity of the assault. German tanks, infantry, and artillery descended upon the unsuspecting front lines, catching soldiers in a deadly trap. Roads and supply lines were torn apart as the enemy cut through like a knife through butter. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, found his command stretched to its limits. The Allies had been unprepared for a winter offensive, and now they found themselves scrambling to hold on to their positions. But amidst the chaos, one American commander stood firm, unyielding in the face of overwhelming odds. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, in command of the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, was thrust into the heart of this battle. The town, surrounded by the relentless German advance, was fast becoming the fulcrum upon which the fate of the entire campaign would pivot. With thousands of his men pinned down, McAuliffe knew that retreat was not an option. The Germans believed that they could break him, just as they had broken so many before him. But McAuliffe's resolve would prove to be a different force altogether. When the German command issued an ultimatum for McAuliffe's surrender, they believed it was a mere formality. The response, however, would not come in words of negotiation. It would come as a single defiant utterance: nuts. This moment, seemingly small in the grand sweep of war, would reverberate far beyond the confines of Bastogne. What they did not know was that this stubborn refusal would not only defy their expectations, but it would also become the rallying cry that turned the tide of the Battle of the Bulge itself. As German forces closed in, the battle's course seemed set, but the war was about to change in ways no one could have predicted. In the cold shadows of the Ardennes, a battle for survival was beginning. The cold winds of December howled through the Ardennes, carrying with them the grim sounds of battle. Within the beleaguered town of Bastogne, the situation grew more desperate by the hour. General Anthony McAuliffe and the 101st Airborne Division were surrounded by a German force far superior in both numbers and firepower. The German High Command had made their intentions clear: surrender or face complete destruction. The fate of the 101st seemed sealed, yet in the midst of this grim encirclement, McAuliffe remained unshaken. One fateful morning, a German emissary arrived at McAuliffe's command post, carrying a message from the enemy commander. The terms were simple and chilling. The German forces demanded the immediate surrender of the American position. "If you do not surrender," the message warned, "we will destroy you." For most commanders, it was a moment of reckoning, a point at which decisions were made under the looming threat of annihilation. Yet McAuliffe, in the face of the enemy's might, took a moment to read the message. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, yet his reaction was immediate, calm, and resolute. Without flinching, McAuliffe penned his reply. In a simple, two-word answer, he conveyed a defiance that would echo through history: nuts. This single word, terse yet unwavering, sent shockwaves through the German command. The men who received it were stunned, unsure if they had misinterpreted the response. Had McAuliffe truly refused them with such a word? It was a response that spoke not just to the situation, but to the unyielding spirit of the American soldier. Back at the front, McAuliffe's reply did more than just confuse the Germans. It sparked something in his own men, a sense of purpose, a sense of defiance that they had not known they were capable of. Many had never seen combat like this. They were raw, inexperienced, and surrounded by the enemy. But now, they stood united behind a commander who had refused to bow, even when the weight of history seemed to rest on his shoulders. Nuts was more than just a reply. It was a rallying cry that reinforced their resolve, that solidified McAuliffe's place not as a man who bent to pressure, but as one who stood firm in the face of certain doom. And so, in the heart of Bastogne, a defiant answer became a beacon for the embattled 101st Airborne. But what they didn't know was that the Germans, though rattled, would soon find their own resolve tested in ways they never anticipated. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich was gasping for air. The Eastern Front, once a seemingly insurmountable bastion, had crumbled beneath the relentless push of the Soviet forces. Cities like Stalingrad had fallen, and the Nazis were losing their grip on territories they had once considered unassailable. Meanwhile, from the west, the Allies pressed forward, steadily closing in. Yet, in the face of this unraveling empire, Adolf Hitler, cloistered in his Führer bunker, stubbornly clinging to a vision of victory, could see only one path left, a final, desperate gamble. This would be his last attempt to turn the tide. On December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge began, an offensive that would test not just the military might of the Nazis, but the very limits of human endurance. The German High Command, confident in their own strength, launched the attack in the hope that their surprise would break the Allied forces. They had underestimated their enemies before, but now they believed the Allies were weary. Fatigued by years of war, their resolve shattered by the constant pressure from every front. In the Ardennes, amidst the dense forests and frozen ground, the Germans aimed to split the Allied lines in two, severing communications and isolating key forces. This, they thought, would send the Americans into disarray and force them to capitulate. The Nazis had one powerful conviction, that the Americans, caught off guard and surrounded, would surrender quickly. It was a belief rooted not just in military strategy, but in the arrogance that had long defined the Third Reich's approach to war. They had fought in Belgium and France before. They knew how to manipulate the terrain and how to unsettle the enemy. But more than that, they believed the Allied morale was broken, and with that, their resolve. The Germans assumed their adversaries would crumble under the weight of their assault, just as so many had before. Their demand for surrender, issued to General McAuliffe at Bastogne, was not a genuine plea for peace, but a presumption, a belief that the mere force of their presence would bring about a quick and inevitable victory. They had no doubt that the 101st Airborne, outnumbered and surrounded, would fall to their knees in submission. But as they prepared to receive the response they expected, they would soon learn that the men they faced were not the broken, defeated force they had envisioned. The American soldiers holding the line, particularly under McAuliffe's command, were far from ready to yield. And in this moment, where arrogance met resolve, the Germans would soon discover that the real fight had only just begun. The Nazis had miscalculated. They had failed to understand one key thing. When it came to war, arrogance was as dangerous as any weapon. What they did not know, in that fleeting moment of supposed triumph, was that the heart of the 101st Airborne, unshaken by the demand for surrender, would soon beat with a fierce defiance that would alter the course of their campaign entirely. General Anthony McAuliffe was a man of few words, yet his presence spoke volumes. A seasoned officer with a reputation built not on grand speeches, but on the quiet authority of his actions, he was known for his unwavering resolve. His leadership in the 101st Airborne Division had earned him the respect of his men, respect forged through his cool-headed decision-making, his ability to stay calm under pressure, and his refusal to abandon his soldiers. McAuliffe had seen tough situations before. He had commanded men through hostile terrain, had led them in combat where victory was uncertain, and had stood firm when others had faltered. But nothing could have prepared him for the dire circumstances that unfolded in December 1944, when the Germans launched their surprise offensive in the Ardennes. As the German forces closed in on Bastogne, McAuliffe's command post became a symbol of isolation. His troops, surrounded and vastly outnumbered, were running low on ammunition and supplies. The weight of command bore heavily on him. He understood the grim reality of the situation. Surrender was not just a choice. It was a surrender of everything the 101st had fought for, everything they had worked for. McAuliffe would rather die than concede. This was not bravado or reckless defiance, but a deep, pragmatic belief that the only way to win was to hold out. His mind, razor-sharp despite the chaos, focused on a single thought. If they could hold on long enough, reinforcements would come. The German offensive would falter. He trusted that the Allies, despite their stretched resources, would respond. When the German demand for surrender arrived, McAuliffe read the ultimatum with calm detachment. The Germans had given them an out: lay down arms, avoid destruction. In most circumstances, such a request might have been met with desperate consideration. But McAuliffe saw it as more than just a tactical move. He recognized it for what it was: an attempt to break their will, to make them bend before overwhelming force. The general's response came not as an act of desperation, but as a calculated move in psychological warfare. A simple, blunt word: nuts. The one-word reply was more than just a refusal. It was a defiant statement of purpose. McAuliffe wasn't simply saying no to the Germans. He was sending a message to his own men. By standing firm in the face of such overwhelming pressure, he reinforced their belief that they could withstand anything. His decision was not about bravado, it was about survival, about inspiring his soldiers to stand their ground when retreat seemed inevitable. It was a declaration that the 101st Airborne would not break. They would fight on. In that moment, McAuliffe's response did more than just infuriate the German command. It reignited the fighting spirit of the men under his command. The soldiers of the 101st, many of whom had never faced an enemy so relentlessly determined, found themselves emboldened by their leader's unflinching resolve. They too would stand firm, and so the Battle of Bastogne became a fight not just for territory, but for the very soul of the Allied cause. McAuliffe's refusal to surrender would become a defining moment, a symbol of defiance that would inspire not only those trapped in Bastogne, but the entire Allied effort. As the Germans pressed forward, they had one question lingering in their minds: would their unrelenting attack finally break the Americans? What they didn't know was that McAuliffe's decision would ignite something far greater than resistance. It would spark a turning point in the war itself. In the bitter cold of the Ardennes, the Germans sat poised, expecting victory to be handed to them. The message had been delivered, and the terms were clear: surrender or face total destruction. The generals believed the Allied forces, scattered and exhausted, would fold quickly under the pressure. They had fought this war for years, after all, and now, in the final days, they expected the American soldiers to bow to the overwhelming might of the German army. Yet, when the reply came, it shattered their assumptions. The single word, nuts, rang out, defying everything the Germans believed about the Allied resolve. At first, the German commanders could scarcely believe their ears. Surely, this was a joke, a misunderstanding, a response unworthy of serious consideration. How could a general, faced with the direst of circumstances, answer so bluntly, so dismissively? This was no ordinary exchange of military communications. It was an affront, a refusal to submit, and they were unsure how to process it. The demand for surrender had been met with ridicule. They had anticipated a quick capitulation, yet what they received was nothing short of defiance. In the days that followed, as the German forces continued their relentless assault, it became painfully clear: McAuliffe's response was no joke. The American defenders were not only holding their ground, but they were steadfast in their refusal to yield. As the days turned into nights, the Germans realized the situation was not as simple as they had once thought. Their expectations were unraveling before their eyes. The weather was against them, their supply lines were stretched thin, and the morale of the soldiers who had been certain of an easy victory now began to erode. What had begun as a show of force, meant to shake the resolve of the Allies, had instead fortified it. McAuliffe's defiance resonated far beyond the walls of Bastogne. It rippled across the battlefield, carried not only by the soldiers trapped within the town, but by the very spirit of the Allied cause. The Germans, who believed they had broken the will of the enemy, were now confronted with something they had not expected, a resistance that would not bend. It was not just the answer of a single general, it was a symbol of everything the Allies had been fighting for. The message was clear. The resolve of the American soldiers, and of the Allied forces as a whole, was unshakable. In the corridors of power in Berlin, Hitler and his generals had imagined that they held the moral high ground, that their demand for surrender would break the American spirit. They believed the psychological advantage was theirs to take. But in the cold of Bastogne, McAuliffe's simple answer reversed that perception. The nuts reply was more than a rejection of surrender. It was a psychological victory, a defiant stand that would galvanize the Allies and inspire them to hold on. It marked the beginning of the end for the German offensive, and in hindsight would come to be seen as the moment when their confidence cracked. What the Germans had miscalculated was not just the strength of their opponent's military might, but the strength of their resolve. And so, the tide began to turn. The momentum that the Germans had hoped to carry through their surprise attack started to slip from their grasp, all because of a single word. In the coming days, the Allied forces would draw strength from McAuliffe's defiance, and the Germans, now on the back foot, would find themselves outmatched in ways they could never have anticipated. The Germans had once believed the moral victory was theirs, but what they didn't know was that in their moment of triumph, they had sown the seeds of their own defeat. By December 1944, the 101st Airborne Division found itself isolated in the heart of the Ardennes, cut off from any hope of resupply or reinforcement. The German offensive, designed to split the Allied forces and deliver a crushing blow to morale, had done its work. Bastogne, once a quiet town, had become the focal point of the Battle of the Bulge. The German forces surrounded the Americans on all sides, their strategy clear: starve the defenders, force them into submission, and shatter their will. With each passing day, the ring around Bastogne grew tighter, and the walls of resistance seemed to close in. The Germans believed that this would be the moment when the American spirit would break, that the isolation, hunger, and cold would force them to yield. But what they failed to account for was the unshakable resolve of the men they had trapped. General McAuliffe, resolute and pragmatic, knew the odds were grim. His division was vastly outnumbered, their supplies running low, and the winter conditions were nothing short of brutal. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, McAuliffe's leadership turned what seemed like an inevitable surrender into a symbol of defiance. He had seen his men through tough times before, but now they faced an enemy more determined, more relentless than ever. And yet, as the days turned to weeks, McAuliffe refused to entertain any thought of giving in. He knew that the key to survival lay not just in holding their position, but in holding their will. Bastogne, surrounded by German forces, would stand, not out of sheer force, but because its defenders believed in the possibility of something beyond their immediate suffering. The soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat like this, took refuge in their defensive positions, digging in as the cold bite of winter pierced their ranks. The Germans had anticipated that hunger and desperation would soon break the American line. The freezing temperatures, compounded by relentless bombardment, made the battle all the more grueling. But for McAuliffe, there was no question of surrender. Every message he sent was one of resistance. Every order was delivered with unyielding clarity. The 101st would not bend. His men, drawn from the farthest corners of the American forces, rallied behind his unshakable resolve. They clung to the hope that reinforcements would come, even as the German siege pressed ever closer. The siege, though it seemed hopeless from the outside, became a test, not just of military strategy, but of American ingenuity and willpower. McAuliffe's ability to maintain a cohesive defense despite the odds was a testament to the strength of the men under his command. The Germans, expecting an easy victory, found themselves ensnared by their own arrogance. Bastogne had become more than just a battlefield. It had become a symbol. The defenders dug in, not just with their weapons, but with their minds, holding on to the belief that if they could endure just a little longer, the balance might shift. For the German forces, Bastogne was quickly becoming a trap. They had underestimated the Americans in a way they hadn't anticipated. The defenders of Bastogne were not surrendering, they were surviving, and with every passing day, their resolve grew stronger. What the Germans had seen as an opportunity to break the Allied spirit, they now realized was a test they could not win. The Americans were not breaking, they were digging in, and with each passing moment, the tide of the battle shifted ever so slightly in their favor. What began as a siege that seemed sure to end in defeat was now the beginning of something much larger, an American victory. As the German forces closed in, the situation seemed increasingly dire, but the message had already been sent. Through the defiance of McAuliffe, through the will of the men in the trenches, the Allies would not break. Bastogne would stand, but what the Germans didn't know was that the fight for Bastogne was not just a battle for the town, it was a battle for the very heart of the war, and the Americans, though surrounded and isolated, were far from beaten. Outside the besieged town of Bastogne, the situation had reached a critical point. The 101st Airborne Division, cut off and surrounded by German forces, had held out for days, weeks in fact, against overwhelming odds. The Germans believed that the siege would be the final blow, the moment when American resolve would break. But what they had failed to account for was the resilience of McAuliffe's men and the unyielding determination of the Allied command. While the defenders of Bastogne fought and endured, outside the town, the wheels of the larger Allied war effort were quietly turning, mobilizing for what would become one of the most critical moments of the Battle of the Bulge. General George S. Patton's Third Army, one of the most formidable fighting forces in the Allied arsenal, was positioned just to the south of Bastogne. Patton, a commander known for his boldness and unrelenting drive, understood the significance of this moment. He had heard the reports of the siege and knew that if Bastogne fell, it could mean the collapse of the entire Allied line. In the bitter cold and under treacherous conditions, Patton's forces began to mobilize for a counteroffensive. His men, already weary from months of fighting, now had to navigate snow-covered roads, frozen rivers, and worsening weather in order to reach Bastogne. It was a monumental task, yet Patton's resolve was as steadfast as ever. His Third Army, moving with a speed that defied the cold, would soon change the course of the battle. For the defenders of Bastogne, the arrival of reinforcements was nothing short of a lifeline. With their supply lines cut and their food and ammunition running dangerously low, McAuliffe's men had held on by sheer force of will. But as the days wore on, their strength was fading. It was the promise of relief that kept them fighting, the knowledge that help was on the way. And then, at last, Patton's forces arrived. The sight of fresh troops and supplies, a signal that reinforcements had broken through the German encirclement, reignited the soldiers' spirits. The arrival of these new forces was not just a logistical victory, it was a morale boost that bolstered the resolve of the 101st, who now knew that they would not have to face the Germans alone. With the arrival of Patton's men, the balance of power began to shift. The Germans, having believed they could strangle the Americans into submission, now found themselves in a desperate situation. Their lines were stretched thin, and their supplies were dwindling. The weather, which had once worked in their favor, now became an obstacle, slowing their ability to resupply and reinforce their forces. The Americans, by contrast, were now well-equipped and emboldened by the fresh influx of resources. McAuliffe's steadfast defense, combined with the new momentum from the relief forces, began to turn the tide. The Germans, who had expected victory to come quickly and easily, now realized that their plans had failed. The siege of Bastogne, once seen as a certain victory, had become a trap they could not spring. Patton's famous maneuvering, the speed and audacity that had earned him his reputation, proved to be the turning point. As his forces advanced toward Bastogne, the German positions began to crumble. What had once seemed like an inevitable victory for the Axis now felt like a distant memory. The Germans, already facing shortages of ammunition and fuel, found themselves unable to sustain the pressure of the Allied advance. The battle, which had once been about breaking the spirit of the American forces, was now about the collapse of the German offensive itself. For General McAuliffe and his men, the arrival of reinforcements proved that their defiance had been more than just an act of stubbornness. It had been a calculated stand against overwhelming odds, a refusal to yield in the face of certain defeat. McAuliffe's legendary response to the German demand for surrender, the single word "nuts," had not only become a rallying cry, it had now been proven to be more than just bravado. It had been a moment of clarity, a moment that signaled to the Germans that they had underestimated the will of the American soldier. The Germans, in their arrogance, had believed victory was theirs to claim. But as Patton's forces pushed forward, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The American forces were not broken. They were not about to be coerced into surrender. They were ready to fight, to endure, and to win. In the cold, icy winds of the Ardennes, the Allies had not just held their ground, they had reclaimed it. The siege of Bastogne was no longer just a battle for a town, it was a battle that would come to define the Allied resolve and mark the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Germans, unaware of the reinforcements on the horizon, were losing ground. But what they didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The Americans, emboldened by their victory at Bastogne, would soon strike at the heart of the German forces, changing the course of the war forever. By January 1945, the German forces in the Ardennes were beginning to realize the truth. Their position was untenable. What had started as a bold, desperate attempt to split the Allied lines and regain the initiative had devolved into an increasingly dire situation. The weather, which had initially worked in their favor, had become a hindrance. Supplies were running low. Communication lines were fractured, and the morale of the troops that had once surged with the expectation of an easy victory now faltered. The Germans had believed that by isolating and strangling the 101st Airborne in Bastogne, they could break the will of the American forces and force a surrender. But what they failed to anticipate was the unyielding resolve of General McAuliffe and the men under his command. The siege of Bastogne, now dragging into weeks, had become more than just a military operation. It had become the defining moment of the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans had counted on the psychological weight of their attack to collapse the American defense. They had anticipated that hunger, cold, and isolation would push the Americans to surrender, but McAuliffe's refusal to yield and his legendary response to their demand had proven them wrong. Nuts had resonated far beyond the walls of Bastogne, echoing through the hearts of the men trapped within and across the entire Allied command. What the Germans had seen as a show of defiance was now a symbol of the unbreakable spirit of the American forces. McAuliffe's words embodied the will to resist, the refusal to allow the enemy to dictate terms, and as the days wore on, this defiance became more than just an act of stubbornness. It became a rallying cry. With each passing day, the German forces were stretched thinner. The battle for Bastogne, which they had expected to win with ease, had instead drained their resources and manpower. German soldiers, once confident in their imminent victory, began to feel the weight of failure. The siege that was supposed to be a quick and decisive triumph had instead turned into a costly endeavor. Supplies dwindled, reinforcements were delayed, and the ever-present winter conditions exacted a toll on the German ranks. As the German High Command watched the situation deteriorate, they began to recognize the inevitable. Their assault on Bastogne was failing, and with it, their larger offensive was crumbling. Meanwhile, the men of the 101st, though outnumbered and fatigued, held firm. They had survived the worst, and now they were fighting with renewed strength. The arrival of reinforcements, the breaking of the German siege, and the sight of fresh troops arriving under General Patton's command reinvigorated the men inside Bastogne. They had clung to the belief that help would come, and now that belief was being realized. The spirit of the 101st, which had been tested to its limits, was now a fire that burned brighter than ever. The arrival of Patton's forces, combined with McAuliffe's unwavering leadership, made it clear the German strategy had failed. The lines of communication between the German commanders and their soldiers became more strained, their coordination more erratic. The once immense pressure they had applied to the Americans began to evaporate. As the Germans withdrew, their forces scattered and disorganized, the tide of the battle shifted. What had once seemed like a certain German victory now appeared to be a devastating defeat. McAuliffe's defiance had cost the Germans more than they had bargained for, not just in lives and resources, but in their own confidence. The psychological impact of Bastogne would resonate for years to come. For the German forces, the battle had been about more than territory. It had been about breaking the spirit of the American soldier, but they had underestimated that spirit. McAuliffe's refusal to surrender and his men's steadfastness in the face of impossible odds had shown the Germans that the American line could not be broken, that surrender was not an option. The Battle of the Bulge, once seen as the moment that could reverse the course of the war, began to pivot in favor of the Allies. What had been a desperate attempt by the Germans to regain the initiative had now turned into a decisive turning point. The moment McAuliffe had delivered his famous one-word response, "nuts," had not only sealed the fate of the siege, it had sealed the fate of the larger offensive. The German forces, once confident in their ability to crush the Americans, had been repelled, and with them, any hope of breaking the Allied resolve. McAuliffe's defiance had become a symbol of the Allied strength, a testament to the resilience of the soldiers who refused to yield. As the Germans retreated, the Allies pressed forward. What had been a tenuous situation for the Americans now turned into the beginning of the end for the Nazi forces. The breaking point had come. The Germans had failed, and the Allies had proven that no matter the odds, they would never bend. But the question remained: how much longer could the Germans continue to fight with the bitter taste of defeat fresh in their mouths? By February 1945, the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest confrontation on the Western Front since D-Day, was all but over. The German offensive, which had so suddenly erupted in December, had failed to achieve its objectives. The Nazis had hoped to sever the Allied forces, split their lines, and deliver a crushing blow to their morale. Yet, despite the initial shock of the surprise attack, the resilience of the American forces and of the men at Bastogne had begun to shift the tide. The Germans, stretched thin and unable to sustain their momentum, were now in full retreat. What had begun as an audacious gamble by Hitler had collapsed under the weight of its own overreach. The 101st Airborne Division, though battered by weeks of siege and combat, stood victorious. General McAuliffe and his men, who had endured the harshest of conditions, frozen ground, constant bombardment, dwindling supplies, had held their ground in Bastogne, a symbol of defiance and resilience. When the Germans had expected them to break, the men of the 101st had not only survived, but had forced the enemy to retreat. The myth of the invincible German army had begun to crack. The once unstoppable force had now been repelled by a steadfast, determined American force that had refused to yield. As the German forces fell back, the path to victory in Europe became clearer for the Allies. The retreat from Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies, and with each day, the prospect of victory drew nearer. McAuliffe's defiance, embodied in his simple but powerful response to the German demand for surrender, had become a pivotal turning point in the war. His refusal to bow under pressure had not just saved Bastogne, it had injected the Allied forces with renewed strength and purpose, reaffirming their belief that victory was within reach. The Battle of the Bulge had, in its early days, seemed like a last-ditch effort by the Nazis to turn the war in their favor. But as the battle ground to a halt, with the German offensive in ruins, the Allies began to press forward. The Nazis had overestimated their ability to break the American line, and the failure of their final offensive left them vulnerable to the coming Allied push. As the Allies advanced, the specter of victory grew larger. The shattered remnants of the German forces now faced the daunting reality of what lay ahead, the march of the Allies toward Berlin and the final collapse of the Nazi regime. McAuliffe's single word, nuts, had reverberated far beyond the walls of Bastogne. It had become a symbol of the unyielding spirit of the American soldier and a turning point in the war. In that simple, defiant reply, the Allies had found not only victory, but the resolve to finish the fight. The Battle of the Bulge would forever be remembered not as a moment of desperation, but as the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Now, with the German forces retreating, the Allies had only one goal left: Berlin. But as the Allies prepared to push into the heart of the Nazi Empire, one question lingered. How much longer could the German leadership maintain their hold on a collapsing war machine? What they didn't know was that the end of the Bulge was only the beginning of the final chapter in a war that would soon be brought to its devastating conclusion. As the war in Europe neared its final months, the echoes of Bastogne reverberated across the continent. The moment when General Anthony McAuliffe had stood resolute in the face of overwhelming odds, replying to the German demand for surrender with a single defiant word, nuts, became more than just a footnote in the history of the Battle of the Bulge. It became a symbol, not just of defiance, but of the unyielding American spirit. McAuliffe's response, concise and audacious, struck a chord with soldiers and civilians alike. It served as a rallying cry, a beacon of resistance that spread far beyond the frozen forests of Belgium. For the Allies, it was not just the victory at Bastogne that mattered. It was the way in which that victory had been achieved. The image of the besieged American forces, unbroken and unyielding, pushed forward the belief that the war was not just something to survive, but something that could be won. The Allied forces, spurred by the bravery and defiance shown at Bastogne, advanced relentlessly through the winter of 1945. McAuliffe's example of courage under fire became a cornerstone of the broader Allied effort. With each mile of ground gained, every retreating German soldier was reminded of the American resolve they had so desperately underestimated. What began as an attempt to break the Allied spirit had in fact fueled it. The power of McAuliffe's defiance was not just in its immediacy, but in its ripple effect, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was strength in standing firm, in refusing to yield. Soldiers from all corners of the Allied forces, each facing their own battles, drew inspiration from McAuliffe's leadership, finding courage in his example to press forward with renewed determination. On the other side of the conflict, the impact of Bastogne was no less profound. The German military, once so confident in its ability to crush the Allies, found its morale shattered by the failure at Bastogne. The German command had believed they could break the will of the American forces, but instead they had witnessed the depth of American resolve. The sight of an American general refusing to capitulate, refusing to bend to the pressure of siege, was a bitter blow to a Nazi war machine already on the brink of collapse. The Germans, who had pushed so hard for a victory in the Ardennes, now found themselves retreating, their offensive unraveling in the face of the steadfastness shown at Bastogne. The retreat back into Germany was not just a physical withdrawal, it was a collapse of confidence. The realization that they could no longer dictate the course of the war. As the German forces scrambled to defend their homeland, the Battle of the Bulge itself transformed into a symbol of Allied resilience. What had seemed like a potential turning point in favor of the Nazis now stood as the moment when the tide turned decisively against them. The myth of the invincible German army, so deeply ingrained in the psyche of the Third Reich, had been shattered. The battle's conclusion showed the world, and most importantly, the German soldiers themselves, that the Nazis could be beaten, that even in their own heartland they were vulnerable. The fact that the Americans had held firm, had not given an inch, reverberated through the ranks of the Wehrmacht. They had seen what true resistance looked like, and it had been American. McAuliffe's legacy was not just defined by the events of Bastogne. His refusal to yield in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds had earned him a place in history as one of the great leaders of the war. But beyond the tactical brilliance of his defense, it was the moral clarity of his defiance that set him apart. His leadership was rooted in a belief that no matter how dark the moment, there was always a choice to stand firm. And in that moment of defiance, when his troops could have easily given in, McAuliffe had not only preserved his division, but had inspired a generation to believe in the power of resistance. By the time the Allies were pushing into the heart of Germany, the war was clearly turning in their favor. The retreating Germans, with the shadow of defeat hanging over them, could no longer pretend they had the upper hand. The Battle of the Bulge had demonstrated the depth of their vulnerability, and with each passing day, the Allies grew closer to Berlin. McAuliffe, though far from the front lines in the final push, had already cemented his place as a symbol of American resolve. His defiance, born in the frozen forests of Belgium, would live on in the victory that was now within reach. The war, though still raging, was entering its final stages, and as the Allies marched forward, the question lingered. How much longer could the German resistance hold out, knowing they had already been beaten in spirit, if not yet in body? The collapse of Nazi Germany was inevitable, but Bastogne, McAuliffe's unyielding stand, had made that reality clear for all to see. It was the moment when the tide had truly begun to turn. But what the Germans didn't realize yet was that the worst was yet to come. The end was near, As the spring of 1945 dawned, the war in Europe entered its final decisive phase. The once unstoppable German war machine was now a crumbling relic, unable to withstand the combined might of the Allies. From the west, American and British forces surged into Germany, while from the east, the Soviets pushed relentlessly, closing in on Berlin. The two fronts were converging, and the walls around the Nazi regime were closing in. What had seemed unthinkable just months before, total German defeat, was now an inevitability. The war, which had raged for over 5 years, was finally nearing its conclusion. The Reich, once proud and powerful, was collapsing under the weight of unrelenting pressure from every direction. In these final days, the legacy of General McAuliffe's defiance continued to resonate. His leadership, though demonstrated in the cold and desperate moments of Bastogne, had proven to be more than just a temporary triumph. It had become a symbol of the broader Allied resolve. McAuliffe's refusal to surrender to the German forces, even in the face of overwhelming odds, echoed in the final stages of the war. His words, "nuts," had sparked not only a tactical victory, but a broader cultural shift within the American military. That single word had become emblematic of the American spirit in war, unyielding, defiant, and resolute in the face of adversity. McAuliffe's example served as a touchstone for the soldiers pressing forward in the final battles, inspiring them to endure, to fight on, knowing that victory was within reach. As the Allies advanced deeper into Germany, the German forces, already stretched thin and disorganized, found themselves trapped between two overwhelming armies. The collapse of Nazi Germany was no longer a matter of if, but when. The cities that had once been symbols of Nazi power, Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich, were now either in ruins or surrounded. The military leadership that had once believed in victory now found themselves desperately negotiating the terms of surrender. It was clear that the Reich had no choice but to yield. On May 7, 1945, Nazi Germany officially surrendered, marking the end of World War II in Europe. The surrender was not just a military victory, it was the end of an era of tyranny, the collapse of a regime that had sought to dominate the continent and beyond. But even as the German surrender marked the official end of the conflict in Europe, the legacy of the war lived on. And in that legacy, General McAuliffe's defiance stood as a testament to the power of resilience. His refusal to capitulate, his leadership under the most extreme duress, and his ability to inspire his men to hold firm against the German siege had set an example that would endure far beyond the battlefield. McAuliffe's single-word response to the German demand for surrender would be remembered not just as a tactical victory, but as a symbol of American tenacity and determination. His leadership had shown that, no matter the odds, no matter the situation, surrender was never the only option. The ultimate collapse of the Nazi regime was, in many ways, the ultimate expression of the power of resilience. The Germans, who had once believed they could impose their will on Europe, were now in retreat, beaten by the very qualities they had underestimated: the courage, the persistence, and the unwavering spirit of the Allied forces. The war had revealed a fundamental truth. The will to resist, the refusal to bow under pressure, was as powerful as any weapon on the battlefield. And McAuliffe's defiance had embodied that spirit, not just for his men, but for all who would follow. His legacy would become a beacon for future generations of soldiers, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, victory could be won through unwavering resolve. As the war in Europe came to its long-awaited conclusion, the world began to turn its attention to the rebuilding process. The fall of the Reich had ended the Nazi nightmare, but the scars of war would take years to heal. Yet as the Allies began the difficult task of reconstruction, McAuliffe's moment of defiance would continue to resonate. His leadership, his refusal to surrender, would become a model for future generations of military leaders. The spirit of Bastogne, the example of resilience in the face of impossible odds, would live on in the soldiers who fought after him, and in the generations that would study the history of World War II. The surrender of Nazi Germany marked the end of the war, but McAuliffe's legacy, built on the foundation of one bold, unwavering word, would transcend the battlefield. His defiance had become more than just a part of history. It had become a symbol of what the human spirit could achieve, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. It was a legacy of resilience, one that would inspire soldiers long after the guns had fallen silent, and remind the world of the power of standing firm when everything seems to be falling apart. In the years that followed the end of World War II, the name General Anthony McAuliffe became synonymous with courage and resolve. The war had come to its conclusion, but for those who had lived through it, the lessons of Bastogne remained vivid, etched into the very fabric of the Allied victory. McAuliffe's leadership in those bitter, frozen days of December 1944 would become one of the most studied and revered chapters in military history. His calm defiance under siege, embodied in his legendary one-word response, "Nuts," became more than just a symbol of resistance. It became the embodiment of the American spirit during the war. McAuliffe's refusal to surrender to overwhelming odds captured the imagination of military strategists and historians alike. It was not simply the tactical brilliance of his defense that was admired, but his steadfastness in leadership. The ability to inspire his men to hold their ground when retreat seemed inevitable was a quality that would be remembered long after the last shots of the war were fired. In the decades that followed, his leadership became a case study in military academies around the world. His response, "Nuts," was not merely a rejection of surrender. It was a rallying cry for anyone facing seemingly insurmountable odds. It became a lesson in resilience, a reminder that courage was not measured by the size of the enemy or the weight of the forces pressing down on you, but by the strength of your resolve. As the years passed, McAuliffe's legacy grew. He became a revered figure not just in military circles, but in the broader culture of post-war America. His leadership at Bastogne had transcended the battlefield, inspiring generations of soldiers, leaders, and ordinary citizens. It was not just the defiance of one man, but the reflection of a collective will to persevere against tyranny and to stand firm in the face of evil. His example became a beacon for those who followed in his footsteps, a guiding light in times of hardship. In the stories passed down to new generations, McAuliffe's steadfastness became an enduring metaphor for the triumph of spirit over adversity. Yet McAuliffe's legacy was not confined solely to the military sphere. His name, and the spirit he embodied, became woven into the very fabric of American identity. The phrase "nuts" took on a significance that went beyond the walls of the Ardennes. It became a symbol of defiance not just in war, but in any battle against seemingly insurmountable odds. It represented the idea that even when all seemed lost, the will to fight could tip the balance in favor of those who refused to give up. McAuliffe's leadership in Bastogne became a touchstone for resilience, and the courage shown in the Ardennes would be remembered as a turning point in the Allies' final push toward victory. The fight in Bastogne, though costly and bloody, marked a shift in the momentum of the war. What had begun as a desperate German offensive to split the Allies had instead ignited the will of the American forces to resist and fight back. The Germans, having believed they could break the American spirit, were now facing an army that had been steeled in the fires of battle. The siege of Bastogne had become a microcosm of the greater struggle, a struggle not just for territory, but for the very soul of the war. And as the Allies pushed forward, buoyed by the spirit of resistance embodied in McAuliffe's leadership, the path to victory in Europe became ever clearer. Today, McAuliffe's legacy stands as one of the most iconic in the annals of military history. The lessons learned in the Ardennes, lessons of leadership, defiance, and the unyielding pursuit of victory, continue to resonate. His example is taught in military academies, not just as a tale of battlefield success, but as a testament to the power of the human spirit to endure and to overcome. In the years since the war, McAuliffe's leadership in Bastogne has remained a shining example of what it means to lead when the odds are stacked against you, and to fight when surrender is the only other option. His story serves as a reminder that, no matter the scale of the challenge, the strength of one individual can spark the fire of a larger movement. The war ended, but the lessons of defiance and leadership that McAuliffe exemplified would endure, carried forward in the hearts of future generations. His legacy, and the courage shown by the men who stood with him, would forever be remembered as a pivotal moment in the story of World War II, and a testament to the enduring power of resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. In the years following World War II, as the world began to rebuild and heal from the scars of conflict, the lessons learned on the battlefield continued to resonate. The war had left its mark on every nation, but the leadership displayed during those harrowing years served as a beacon for future generations. In the wake of Nazi Germany's surrender, the world looked back, not just at the victories won through brute force, but at the indomitable resolve that had guided the Allies to triumph. Among the many leaders whose decisions shaped the course of history, General Anthony McAuliffe stood out for his extraordinary leadership under pressure, particularly during the siege of Bastogne. His defiance, symbolized by the simple yet profound response to the German demand for surrender, was a testament to the power of resilience. McAuliffe's leadership in the face of such overwhelming odds became a symbol of what true strength looked like, not simply in terms of military strategy or firepower, but in the strength of character. His refusal to surrender, his resolve in the face of isolation and desperation, embodied a fundamental truth. Victory is often won not through sheer force, but through the unwavering will to stand firm. The siege of Bastogne had been a test, and McAuliffe had passed it with a single word. In a world scarred by war, his steadfastness offered a rare and shining example of moral clarity and courage, reminding the world that in the most dire moments, the right course was not always the easiest or the most immediate, but the one that required the most courage to pursue. When Nazi Germany formally surrendered in May 1945, it brought a sense of closure to the war in Europe, but it did not close the chapter on what had been learned during those years of struggle. McAuliffe's leadership, particularly his decision to reject the German demand for surrender with the now legendary nuts, became something much more than a tactical moment. It became a symbol of what it meant to refuse to yield. In a world reeling from the devastation of total war, McAuliffe's act of defiance had shown that there was still strength to be found in standing firm. His resolve echoed the larger spirit of the Allied victory, proving that victory was not just about winning battles, but about refusing to be broken. In the decades that followed, McAuliffe's story was retold again and again, a source of inspiration for generations yet to come. His one-word response to the German ultimatum, initially seen as a simple act of military resistance, became something far more profound. Nuts was no longer just a rejection of surrender. It encapsulated the essence of the Allied fight against tyranny. It became a rallying cry for those who faced seemingly insurmountable odds, a reminder that resilience, leadership, and the ability to hold firm were as powerful as any weapon in war. McAuliffe's courage was not just a legacy for soldiers, but for civilians and leaders alike, a universal lesson in the power of moral conviction and unflinching resolve. McAuliffe's legacy, forever intertwined with the success at Bastogne, became a cornerstone of military history. His story was studied in military academies, his leadership exemplified as the epitome of what it meant to lead under duress. Yet his influence reached far beyond the battlefield. In the years after the war, as the world rebuilt and began to reflect on the cost of global conflict, McAuliffe's example served as a model for leaders in all walks of life. The leadership he displayed in Bastogne was not just military, it was human, a profound reminder that the greatest victories are often those won not by force alone, but through the conviction to stand for what is right, even when the world around you seems to crumble. As the years passed, McAuliffe's name remained synonymous with resilience. His single word, nuts, was repeated in classrooms, in speeches, in stories shared by veterans, and by those who sought inspiration in the darkest hours. It was a word that became more than just a historical anecdote. It became a mantra for anyone who found themselves in the face of adversity, a reminder that surrender was never the only option. The war had ended, but the lessons it taught were eternal. McAuliffe's leadership, grounded in courage and determination, continued to guide future leaders in times of challenge, showing them that true victory comes not when you give in, but when you stand firm. The surrender of Nazi Germany may have ended the war, but the legacy of those who fought and led with integrity, like McAuliffe, would continue to shape the future. His story, forever tied to the Battle of Bastogne, would live on as a testament to the power of defiance, the importance of leadership, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. It was a legacy not just of military triumph, but of the moral victory that comes from standing for what is right, even when the odds are overwhelming. And as the world moved forward from the horrors of war, McAuliffe's example would remain a guiding light, a reminder that the true strength of a people is found in their unwavering will to never surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply to the German demand for surrender, nuts, seems at first glance like a simple, perhaps even flippant response to an enemy's ultimatum. But in that moment, in the bitter cold of Bastogne, it became much more. It encapsulated a deep moral lesson, that in the face of impossible odds, defiance can ignite victory. The Germans believed that by surrounding the 101st Airborne, by isolating them from the outside world, they could break the spirit of the American soldiers. Yet McAuliffe's response to their demand for surrender was not just a refusal to capitulate, it was a refusal to surrender the spirit of the men who stood with him. The power of that single word reverberated far beyond the confines of the town, setting the tone for the battle to come and, in many ways, for the Allied victory in Europe. The battle for Bastogne was a microcosm of the larger conflict in the Ardennes and, by extension, the war itself. The Germans had come with overwhelming force, expecting a quick victory. They thought that once the Americans were surrounded, outnumbered, and running low on supplies, they would break. But instead, McAuliffe's leadership and the unwavering resolve of his men proved the Germans' assumptions wrong. Even when the odds seemed insurmountable, when surrender appeared to be the only logical option, the 101st Airborne refused to yield. They held their ground, not through superior firepower, but through an unshakable belief in their mission and in each other. The victory at Bastogne did not come from overwhelming force. It came from the strength of character of those who refused to let fear dictate their fate. And it was in that defiance that the spirit of the Allies found its greatest strength. McAuliffe's legacy is not just the military success achieved at Bastogne, but the symbol he became for leadership in the darkest of times. History is shaped not only by the outcome of battles, but by those who step forward to lead when the path ahead seems impossible. In McAuliffe's case, his leadership was not defined by grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but by his steadfast refusal to yield. His decision to stand firm in the face of overwhelming pressure became an enduring lesson in the moral strength that can carry a people through even the most trying of circumstances. The Allies did not win just because they had more soldiers, more weapons, or better tactics. They won because of the unyielding resolve of men like McAuliffe, whose example proved that victory could still be achieved when surrender was not an option. As the war drew to a close and victory was secured in Europe, McAuliffe's act of defiance resonated long after the final surrender. The Allies had defeated the Nazis not just on the battlefield, but in spirit. The moral weight of McAuliffe's simple yet profound response, "Nuts," was felt in the days, months, and even years after the war ended. It became a symbol of the American spirit, a reminder that no matter how dark the moment, no matter how bleak the prospects, the will to resist could turn the tide of history. The world had seen firsthand that even when surrounded and seemingly outmatched, the refusal to surrender one's spirit could change the course of a conflict. In the years that followed, as the world rebuilt from the devastation of war, McAuliffe's name became forever linked to the ideal of unwavering resistance. His one-word reply became more than just a historical moment. It became a parable for future generations. They demanded surrender. He replied with nuts, and history was made. In this single sentence lay the essence of leadership and resilience. When confronted by tyranny, by oppression, or by impossible odds, the decision to hold fast can be the difference between defeat and victory. McAuliffe's legacy would endure as a testament to the power of the human spirit to endure and triumph, a reminder that, often, it is not the size of the enemy or the strength of the arms, but the strength of one's resolve that wins the day. As the world recovered from the war, the lessons from Bastogne continued to guide those in positions of leadership, both in military and civilian life. McAuliffe's defiance had shown the world that history is made by those who refuse to yield, by those who stand firm when surrender seems inevitable. His legacy serves as a powerful reminder that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the power to shape history lies in one's determination to fight for what is right, no matter the cost.